That's it from me. And so next I'm going to pass over to our first speaker of the workshop, Dr. Michelle Portman. Michelle heads the Mar-Coast Ecosystem Integration Lab at the Israel Institute of Technology. Her research focuses on aspects of integrated coastal zone management, marine spatial planning, management of marine protected areas, marine litter from land-based sources, and governance of the land-sea interface. And I'll pass it over to you, Michelle.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, now I have to just share screen, just a minute. Okay, so am I good to go?
Yes, thanks, Michelle.
Okay. All right, so thank you very much. I wanted, first of all, to say thanks to the host, and I just wanted to mention that this is not an easy time. We're in this strange period of global pandemic, and I think that on the one hand, it's a very challenging time. On the other hand, it's also a time of opportunity, and I feel really honored that I can open with this plenary talk in such a huge forum. I mean, this is just unprecedented for me, and I think that, you know, having all these different people from all these different countries, there's a lot of countries that I can't travel to for a number of reasons. So this is a super opportunity for me, and I just wanted to thank the host for putting this together. As Stephanie mentioned, I run a lab at the Technion. I'm an associate professor there in the Faculty of Architecture and Town Planning. Can you hear me okay? I hear a lot of static.
Yes, we can hear you okay. Thanks, Michelle.
Okay, good. Yeah, I hope it doesn't doesn't get to me too much. Yeah, the other thing is, you know, thanks for putting this together. It's a huge challenge. There are, as you mentioned, all kinds of glitches. So I run a lab called Mar-Coast. It's an ecosystem integration lab, and the researchers in the group look at how human activities influence the marine environment and how activities in the marine environment influence the terrestrial environment. And of course, the meeting place is the coast. So we look at a lot of coastal policy and management issues in the social sciences. And as I mentioned, I'm in the Faculty of Architecture and Town Planning. Sometimes that sounds a little strange, but just considering that I work on marine issues. But I just wanted to mention that one of the international experts on marine spatial planning, Charles Eller, is actually an architect, and he started as working in academia as an architect. So, so we're not completely divorced from the marine spatial planning field. Okay, so what I want to talk about, this is what I'm going to talk about more or less, the main points. First, I want to talk about some myths about marine spatial planning and kind of debunk them. There's some things that I consider as misunderstandings, perhaps, and then I'm going to go over some basic concepts of marine spatial planning. I understand most of you know what marine spatial planning is, so hopefully I can build on that. Then the second part of my talk will bring up some common policy tools. And I've picked 3 coastal regulations that can be used for marine spatial planning, or foundations for marine spatial planning. Decision support tools, that's the second one. And those are, of course, those help policymakers and planners make decisions, usually based on, very much based on good data and using GIS. Then, of course, marine protected areas, and these have been proven to be areas that greatly support marine protection and conservation. So the first thing that I want to mention is that I believe, and I've been working for quite a few years in marine spatial planning, among other topics, but a lot in marine spatial planning. There are a few things that are kind of accepted as conventional wisdom that I don't think are accurate necessarily, or at least we have to be cognizant of some of the challenges or some of the differences between what is generally accepted and what actually is. So one of the things that the first thing that I think that needs to be brought up is the newness of marine planning. While it's true that planning in the marine environment is relatively new, we've been doing it for the last, let's say, 2 decades or 3 decades, in the terrestrial environment, planning has been a field and a discipline for a very long time. And while what we're doing is taking a lot of what's been around for a long time and moving into the marine environment. But generally, the ideas of spatial planning are not new. Okay, so we need to recognize that. And of course, recognize some of the differences. What is the difference between terrestrial planning and marine planning? Then the second thing that I want to bring up is that there are a number of things that are, number of principles, I guess, that are in some ways accepted and thought of as kind of, this is marine spatial planning, yet I want to emphasize that that's not necessarily the case, okay? These are things, the integrated nature of MSP. The second is ecosystem-based management and the ecosystem approach. And the third thing is marine spatial planning will bring about marine protection and conservation. While that can be true, it's not guaranteed, okay? And I think that's really important. There's, a lot of talk about integrated marine planning, and usually a marine spatial plan is considered to integrate sectors and landscape uses and the stakeholders and jurisdictions and different levels of government. These are all ideals, and they need to be worked on, and they need to be sought after by planners and, of course, policymakers as well, but those who are responsible for implementing a marine spatial plan. Just to say it is not enough. The same goes for ecosystem-based management and the ecosystem approach. It's always said marine spatial planning is ecosystem-based. What does that actually mean? We have to be really, really careful as planners to make sure that there are management actions that bring us to ecosystem-based management. And lastly, marine spatial planning is thought of to bring about, it's oftentimes promoted as a way to promote marine protection and conservation. Again, the question is what is exactly in the plan and how is it being implemented and what types of monitoring is going on, et cetera, et cetera. So I just took a sentence from the description for this workshop. MSP aims to ensure the protection of marine resources and biodiversity while managing marine activity. While this is often an aim, I think that those who are going into the field and those who are working, I think we're all on the same page that this is what we want. We want to protect marine resources and biodiversity, but the question is, how is that being done? Okay, going backwards just a little bit in terms of, this relates maybe to the newness of marine spatial planning, the idea that, we have this new field and new discipline, and, maybe it's a question of delving into the field of spatial planning in terrestrial environment and moving into the marine environment. So why is this so critical right now? So I contend that there are 2 reasons for that right now, or say in the last couple of decades. One is that resources, I think someone needs to mute there. Thanks. Resources are being overexploited on land. Okay, so there's of course population growth, a lot of economic development in recent decades, and basically we're just doing away with and using up the resources on land. So there's a real push and there's a lot of pressure to move into the marine environment. The second thing is that we have the development of technology. So technologies are allowing us to actually get to the resources and exploit them. So these 2 factors combined are what has enabled us to move, or what is pushing us to move into the marine environment. How is this being done? So there are a lot of different documents, and of course, most of you are, early career, and we have a lot of capacity building, et cetera. I just lost the screen share. Just a second.
I'm sorry, that was my mistake.
No problem. Okay, are we back on? Am I back on?
Yes, thanks, Michelle.
Okay, so I'm sure many of you know that in 2009, a publication came out. There's a little picture of it here. step-by-step approach to marine spatial planning. It's a very good handbook of how to do marine spatial planning. This was put out by UNESCO. We had a directive there. European Union member states are required to develop marine spatial plans. That's from a directive in 2014. From what I understand, many of the countries are behind in that, but that emphasizes the importance of marine spatial planning, and it also it's an opportunity for countries to learn from one another. If they're all having to do marine spatial plans, then there's a lot to learn from each other. And that's actually something that's going on even through this webinar, where we're kind of collecting or cultivating experience, and we're networking and we're learning from one another. Regarding the newness of marine spatial planning, as I mentioned before, there are really important differences between the terrestrial environment and the marine environment, and we need to be cognizant of these. Are people hearing me? Because I'm hearing a ton of noise in the background.
Yes, I just muted the person. Please go ahead.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, sorry, it's just a little, it's a bit hard to concentrate and to talk about that. Okay, so I'm just going to run through these really quickly. This is just a list of differences between the planning in the terrestrial environment, and I've started out my career as a terrestrial planner. I didn't even think about the marine environment. I had no idea I would end up working on the marine environment. So the terrestrial, compared to the terrestrial environment, in the marine environment, we have relatively vague boundaries. The marine environment is highly dynamic. And then there's, of course, the issue of the third dimension. So while in the terrestrial environment, in urban planning and regional planning, we are starting to see more and more of air rights, and those are rights over roads, and we have underground rights, so those are rights that have to do with tunnels or infrastructure being built underground. The exploitation of space that we weren't thinking about before, that's a third dimension, right, below and above. In the marine environment, we always have the third dimension, and it's very variable and highly dynamic. So that's a huge difference. And of course, there's a recent increased economic activity moving into the marine environment because we need those resources. That brings about an increase in stakeholders. And of course, there are gaps in knowledge and data that it's much easier with terrestrial beings. It's much easier to go out into the field and collect data on land than it is in the sea. The data is expensive. It's dispersed in many cases, meaning that it belongs to different entities that are not necessarily working together with each other. The legislation is often undeveloped and unclear in the marine environment, and jurisdictions are often unclear. And whereas in the land environment, we could be talking about a plan for a plot. In the marine environment, it's usually a large area, relatively large area. Here you can see a picture of the Netherlands Marine Spatial Plan. This is an older plan, one of the early ones that was published or developed, finished in 2005. Since then, there have been updates, of course, but you can see here that the different colors, of course, designate the allocation of space for different uses. Okay, another thing that I want to mention that's different in the marine environment as opposed to the land environment is the fact that most of the developed countries, industrial countries, have accepted what's called the public trust doctrine as a basis for a lot of regulation and legislation. And the public trust doctrine is a very important doctrine that dates back to Roman civil law in the 6th century, that basically states that by the law of nature, these things are common to all mankind: the air, running water, the sea, and consequently the shores of the sea. No one, therefore, is forbidden to approach the seashore. So we have a very important fundamental principle that's adopted, and it's relevant for a lot of environmental legislation, but it is true for the sea. In many cases, what is past the waterline is public domain, okay? It's public, it's a public good, it's a common good, and the state has a responsibility to manage those resources in these areas for the public at large. And that's really important. I'll come back to that in a bit. So, so this idea of marine spatial planning being new, my experience has been mostly with marine spatial planning, actual developing a plan, has been mostly in Israel just recently, or more recently, and then in the early days of the Massachusetts Oceans Plan, I was working in Massachusetts at the time, and I know in the US, and I was involved in planning during that time, involved in a particular regulatory program. I'll talk about that in a second. But what happened in Israel, or the reason there was a sudden rush for doing a plan, and we did a plan at the Technion, so that was a plan that was led by academics, myself and another professor. We led the effort, and the reason that this was so important at the time, we started in 2013, we finished and published the plan in 2016, so it was a 3-year effort. And the reason that there was huge interest in this was because in 2010, huge natural gas reserves were reservoirs were located or confirmed off the coast of Israel. So this resource was suddenly very, very important in the ocean, and it was unclear how this would be managed and what uses would be allocated or what regulation would apply, et cetera, et cetera. And one of the reasons that there was a scramble and nobody knew what to do was because what we had in terms of planning documents and what we had in terms of regulation was very minimal. And there were 2 basic policy documents: a national outline scheme for the Mediterranean coast, number 13, that just happens to be the number, and it was relatively outdated from 1983. And the other huge problem with it was that it didn't apply to any areas past the waterline. So any area that was submerged was completely non-existent in this plan. Okay, so that's what we started with, and then in 2000, I mean, that was one of the major policy documents that we had. And then in 2004, there's the Law for the Protection of the Coastal Environment that was passed. However, this is also it only applies to the territorial waters. And you can see there's a polygon in that map there where you can see in the Mediterranean Sea off the coast of Israel that we have an EEZ that goes beyond territorial waters, obviously, and this is where the natural gas reserves were. So we started doing this plan. We published it in 2016. It was done by a staff of academics mostly, and then in the meantime, in parallel, but actually, the Israel Ministry of the Interior, that eventually moved to the Ministry of Finance, the National Planning Authority, started an effort as well, and they are just finishing up now. So this is what the plan, this is the area that the plan applied to. You can see the picture of Tel Aviv Beach, so just to give you an idea of what our Mediterranean seashore looks like. On the bottom on the left, on the right side, you can see the polygon that shows the area addressed in the plan. And you can see, there are different uses here on the map. The yellow outline is what shows the outer extent of Israel's exclusive economic zone. I want to point out that it's the area that's beyond the coastal waters. Okay, so that's the contiguous zone and the territorial sea. Beyond that, it's 22,000 square kilometers and 4,000 square kilometers within the coastal waters. That put together 26,000 square kilometers. That's larger than the land area of the state. So it's not a huge country, but certainly the exclusive economic zone is very important. And in this area, the exclusive economic zone is where most, we had to get our act together to deal with this interest in natural gas. So, okay, so these are the goals, the 12 goals of the plan, and these are the 12 subject areas that were dealt with. I highly recommend that you go to the URL and look. There is an English translation of the plan, so you can look at it and you can see the different scenarios that were developed. And I want to go back for a second to this idea of the newness of marine spatial planning, the so-called newness, right? Okay, so the main questions that we asked in the plan, or what was really kind of like the driving guidelines for us, were these 4 questions. It's very simple. Where are we today? What are the existing conditions? Where do we want to be? Okay, what is the vision? How do we get there? And what have we achieved? So the what have we achieved, the fourth question, of course, that has to do with implementation of the plan, this kind of idea of, an iterative process where you see whether or not goals are reached and whether objectives are being met, et cetera. And then there's kind of an adaptive process of updating the plan over time. So that's kind of the monitoring phase. And generally there's, principles. This is kind of the vision, goals, and then objectives that detail those goals. And finally, management actions. And these are spatially explicit management actions. Why do we have the word marine? Why do we have spatial in the middle of that title, Marine Spatial Planning? Because we're talking about spatially explicit uses, management, and that is the heart of the plan, okay? So that's what's going to get us to where we want to go. And you can see here in this slide, I have another example. This is the German EEZ. You can see that these different colors show different uses and different activities going on. The German EEZ, their marine plan, published in 2008. There have been updates, of course, just the German EEZ in the Baltic Sea. So I've talked about common myths, and I've covered some basic concepts. Now I want to go on to the common policy goals. Sorry, common policy tools. And again, coastal regulations, decision support tools, and marine protected areas. So the first, and these are just, by the way, these are just examples. There are many policy tools and many tools that will help us implement a plan, or that should be talked about in a plan, or even used as the foundations of a plan. One of them, the first one, is building on historic coastal regulations. So before I talked about how we're moving from the terrestrial environment into the marine area, okay, so of course there's different zones. There's the territorial sea, the contiguous zone, et cetera, according to the law of the sea. And as time goes on, we're seeing more human activity farther out from sea. But still, we have already somewhat, in many places, we have coastal regulations that can be used, that can be kind of a foundational basis for further movement into the sea, or certain aspects that are successful. These particular regulations or legislation can be taken advantage of, basically, or can be used. So this particular example is that of the Massachusetts Public Waterfront Act. This is, you can see, it's an old piece of legislation from 1866, so it's been around for a while, and it talks about different use allowances or allocations that are allowed. It's basically a permitting mechanism, but it keeps track of the uses, and you can see here that there's submerged areas, those that are in their different zones, of course, according to where, how far inland you are or how far seaward you are. But I do want to point out that within this legislation, there's a lot of emphasis put on the Commonwealth tidelands. Those are tidelands that are managed by the state, and they're submerged lands, and they go 3 nautical miles out to sea. So these are what's called state waters. And what's really important here is what I mentioned before, the public trust doctrine. This is a 300-page piece of legislation, right? And it's administered by the third program. I can't talk, I'm really sorry, but this buzzing in my ear is just...
Apologies, Michelle, I'm trying to control that.
Okay, I'm going to wait a second, okay, because I can't talk over it. Okay, so, okay, I'm really sorry, but it's really hard for me to concentrate. I don't know. Okay, so, all right, so the point here is, one of the points is that in this, 300 or 200-page act that's been around for a long time, for many years, there's a constant reference to the public trust. And this idea is something that I think that can be incorporated into marine spatial plans as well, especially since we've already got, some of the marine spatial plans are already covering the same area, basically. Submerged lands out to 3 nautical miles. I mean, this is a particular example, but you get the idea, I think. So this is a permit license, basically, the Massachusetts Public Waterfront Act. I just want to show you again the title of the act, Massachusetts Public Waterfront Act. It's administered by the Department of Environmental Protection, and it's called the Waterways Regulation Program, or locally Chapter 91 in the state of Massachusetts. People know what Chapter 91 is. This is a license. This is an example. And there's a use statement in this license that that actually requires the proponent, the holder of the license, only to do certain activities in a particular area. The point of the Act is to ensure water-dependent uses. What are water-dependent uses? These are uses that can only be in the water or near the water or on the coast, okay? And, you know, there's a reason for this. We don't want to give up those areas for just any use, right? And preserve and protect public access. And then most importantly is that when there is use by a private entity, then there has to be public compensation. And that's either payment or actual payment of money, or through the provision of coastal benefits, provision of public benefits. So you can see here, this is obviously very close into shore, but you can see that there's certain things that are required for this use to occur where it occurs. So the next tool is our decision support tools. So this is a tool, this is just an example of a decision support tool that we developed, the Technion Israel Plan team developed to facilitate a number of things. Certainly decision making, of course. We loaded into an application that was developed specifically for this purpose. By the way, ASDA, we call it ASDA, but that means in Hebrew platform, okay, which obviously has connotations relating to exploitation of natural gas and the ocean, right? You need platforms in the ocean. And so, we basically put the data as much as we could into this application that was open to the public, accessible through the website of the planning team of the plan. You can see here the country, the different borders of the sea areas, the territorial sea, the contiguous zone in blue, and then green shows the outer extent of the exclusive economic zone. So some of the advantages to having this type of a tool, it's very easy to put different layers together and see them, of course. Also, to zoom in and zoom out, to put this up on a screen in a public meeting. It also has a place where the public can make notes and draw different polygons in different areas. So the newness, going back again to this idea of the newness or not of marine spatial planning, when planners began planning in the terrestrial environment, developing city plans, physical master plans, and statutory plans, some 100 years ago at least, right? They didn't have these opportunities. So this is something that is really something that's very current, and it is new, and it needs to be used as best as we can. I have some examples here of use of decision support tools in other contexts. So on the left side of the screen, on the bottom there, you can see this is an example of the use of an application called zonation. These are systematic conservation planning tools, GIS-based tools, applications, software applications that seek to find the most efficient allocation of space for certain purposes. And in these cases, all three of them, it's for conservation. So on the bottom left side, you see areas that were, this was actually a case where zonation, this particular application, was used to find the best designation of a network of protected areas, conservation areas that would be protected in view of the needs of commercial fishermen. And this is around New Zealand. If you look at the top on the left, this is the territorial waters. I'm hearing a lot of background noise again. Maybe someone needs to mute. Okay. Thank you. Okay, I can't talk about that noise, sorry. My voice is just not going to deal with it. Okay, so on the left top side, you see the territorial waters of Israel, basically where what's been done is the use of mark sand. Mark sand was used to find, again, the areas that were most suitable for conservation purposes. That was an article that came out in 2014. And then you can see on the right-hand side an article that I published with 2 other co-authors, and it uses multi-criteria analysis for proposing zoning within a marine protected area. A very important, if you're interested in these types of decision support tools, and I highly recommend making use of them if you possibly can, there's a really good document. Okay, there's a really important document that I highly recommend taking a look at. It's called the Decision Guide, put out by Stanford and Woods Institute for the Environment. And this is from 2011, but it's still really interesting in that you can find particularly the systematic look at some of these different decision support tools related to the stage of marine spatial planning that they're suited to. Okay, so on the left-hand side, in the left column, you see a number of different decision support tools listed, and then the different advantages or the different stages that they're most suited to in the marine spatial planning process. The last tool that I want to talk about is that of marine protected areas. And here there's you can see the territorial waters, again, of Israel along the eastern Mediterranean coast. The proposed, this is kind of a wish list that we, as planners working on the marine plan, received from the Israel Nature Parks Authority. The marine protected areas up to now, most of them are very small. They go out maybe, they're not really marine protected areas, they're really coastal protected areas because they go out just a few hundred kilometers from, actually a few hundred meters, sorry, a few hundred meters from the coast. So this wish list that you see here, it shows what the Israel Nature Parks Authority is proposing as expansions for marine protected areas. In marine protected areas, there's a lot of science on marine protected areas, and it's clear from many years of research on closures, even if they're partial closures, only for certain activities and not all activities, it's clear that marine protected areas are fundamental for ensuring ecosystem health. And this is hugely important for achieving this idea of ecosystem-based management. So in terms of species diversity, biomass, density of individual populations, body size, marine protected areas do work. Okay, and there, of course, there are different types of marine protected areas. They can address specific uses, seasonal uses, and certain types of gear being used if we're talking about fishing. The last thing that I want to mention regarding marine protected areas and in general is that we need to think out of the box. And marine spatial planning with regard to marine protected areas is an opportunity for this. It's possible to even think about things like dynamic marine protected areas. In other words, what's called mobile marine protected areas or rolling marine protected areas. And why is this easier to do in a marine spatial planning context? Because you're considering a number of different uses at once, different sectors, this whole idea of integration, right? So on the one hand, in the marine environment, we know that we have many challenges. The transient nature of pollution, a great example is marine litter, invasives, right? At the same time, we also have opportunities. We have opportunities to, if we do the right thing, if we think out of the box, to consider different areas being needed at different times, opportunities for certain organisms to escape conditions that are detrimental to them, things like that. And this is something that we can do when we look at things in an integrated kind of overall, 25,000 foot, mile, meter, whatever, distance, right? So the last thing, the last slide, it shows an example of this. this particular slide shows a page from the NOAA Fisheries Surface where there's tracking of the movement of right whales. There's about 350 right whales left in the world in this particular area in the northeastern United States off the coast of New England. And there's a lot of conflict between where they are at certain times and shipping lanes. So in order to avoid these fatal ship strikes to whales, there's what's called seasonal management areas and dynamic management areas, and these are huge opportunities that can be incorporated within a marine spatial planning framework. Thank you very much, and I'm sorry I kind of lost it there for a while. But
Thank you so much, Michelle, and thanks for your patience with the mute settings. Just another reminder for everyone to please mute yourselves upon entry. Michelle, that was a really great talk to kick off the meeting. You definitely covered a broad range of topics there. We will save any questions for the end of this session where we'll have a Q&A with all of our speakers. So for now, if you could please end your screen sharing and we'll prepare for our next speaker.